Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming to tonight's event, Crossing Borders, Immigration in a New Administration. I'm Nick Seabrook, Professor of Political Science and Director of Public Policy Events here at UNF. This event is part of our Diverse Perspectives series, which promotes open discussion and debate of contested public policy issues from diverse perspectives, facilitates community engagement, intellectual discourse, and the advancement of knowledge, and furthers our core principles of civil discourse and the free exchange of ideas on campus. I'd like to ask our audience members tonight to please be respectful of our panelists and the rights of our attendees to hear what they have to say without interruption or disruption. This event is a conversation, so please hold your comments and questions for the audience Q&A, which will follow immediately after the panel discussion. The United States, it is often said, is a nation of immigrants. Many of us in the room, myself included, are either immigrants ourselves or the sons and daughters of people who came here in search of a better life. In his farewell address to the nation, President Ronald Reagan likened America to a shining city on a hill, built on rocks stronger than oceans and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. Yet we are also a nation committed to the rule of law, whose strength and prosperity depends on the orderly admittance and integration of new participants in the American experiment, and the diligent efforts of our elected officials to uphold the rights, obligations, and principles of a free society. Public opinion polls consistently show that a large majority of Americans prefer a balanced approach to immigration policy, one that includes effective border management and security, robust legal immigration, and a pathway to citizenship for long-time residents. But immigration policy is also an issue that has sharply divided our society and our elected officials in recent years. In the 2024 presidential election, immigration was a top issue of voter concern, with voters delivering a repudiation of the Biden administration's approach and returning Donald Trump to the White House. Tonight, our panel will discuss the implications of that change in leadership and the broader debate about the role that immigration plays in American society. Our panel tonight, from left to right, includes Dr. Holly Miller, Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice and Director of the Master of Science in Criminal Justice program at UNF, a National Institute of Justice W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow, and former president of the Southern Criminal Justice Association. Dr. Miller received her PhD in criminology from the University of South Carolina, and her research focuses on the sociology of immigration, correctional policy, drug treatment in the criminal justice system, and program evaluation. Please welcome Dr. Holly Miller. In the center of our panel is Jessica Vaughn, the Director of Policy Studies for the Center for Immigration Studies, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization. After earning her master's degree from Georgetown University, she served as a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. State Department, and since joining CIS in 1992, has collaborated to launch the annual Conference to Combat Human Trafficking, directed a Department of Justice-funded project on transnational gang suppression, and served as an instructor for senior law enforcement training seminars at Northwestern University's Center for Public Policy. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to UNF to Jessica Vaughn. Finally, we have Dr. Madeline Zawodny, the Donna L. Gibbs and First Coast Systems Professor of Economics at UNF, a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics, a fellow at the Global Labor Organization, and an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Zawodny received her PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and her research focuses on economic issues related to immigration, on which she has authored 2 books. Please welcome Dr. Madeline Zawodny. Tonight, we will have 1 hour for our panel to discuss our topic of immigration policy in the United States, followed by a 30-minute Q&A when audience members will have the opportunity to ask questions of our experts. When we get to the Q&A portion, I'll ask people to please line up at the microphones at the front of the room, and I will call on you to ask questions of our panel. So, my first question for our panel tonight, before we get into the specifics of immigration policy and the records of the Biden and Trump administrations in this area, all 3 of you have spent your careers working in the immigration policy sphere, whether it's from an economics perspective, a criminal justice perspective, or a policy analysis and advocacy perspective. So based on your experience and your knowledge of this policy area, what role do you think immigration should play in American society, and how should public policy effectuate that? Let's begin with Dr. Miller.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Seabrook. I'll say just off the bat, we're going to talk about a lot of things here tonight, and I certainly don't claim to be an expert in every single one of them. My expertise is really in criminology, and specifically the relationship between immigration and crime, both at the macro level in terms of crime rates and also at the micro level in terms of individuals' likelihood to commit crime or delinquency or be victimized. And so I'll sort of say holistically and this is my own opinion, I think immigration, it's prima facie of the importance of immigration. Most of us would not be here in this room if it weren't for immigration. So we have to acknowledge that. I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about the issue. I think it's a very complicated issue. As I said, I can speak with definition about how it relates to criminal justice policy, whether or not immigrant communities represent particularly problematic areas of cities. I'm well versed in the empirical literature on that as well. But as I said, I don't claim to know how many visas should be issued. I don't claim to know how many Border Patrol agents should be at the border. I'm sure my colleagues here have a little bit more insight on some of those things just based on their own research experiences. But certainly it's my opinion that it turned the tide of the election. I think it was a very critical element. And so there is something that definitely has captured the public's attention about this. It's across the spectrum. It's not really a left-right issue. I've talked to people who are lifelong Democrats who express that what's going on at the border is troublesome to them and problematic. So whether that's the optics of it or the empirical reality, it has made a difference. And so I think we do need to confront it. And I see my role as simply providing an empirical reference base by which to move forward with some of those policy suggestions.
Jessica?
Thank you. What should the goal of immigration policy be? I believe that the goal of our immigration policy should be to serve our national interest and to bring in people to our country who are going to be good American citizens ultimately, and be, and join our country and contribute to our country. I think for far too long, immigration policy was serving special interests, such as employers who were looking to hire workers who would work more cheaply than Americans would. There may be times when immigration can contribute to our labor markets in some way. I don't think we're now in one of those times, but in the past, immigration has been viewed as a way to supplement our labor force. But our policy should, as far as the mechanics of the policy, I would just quote the late, great member of Congress and civil rights leader Barbara Jordan from Texas, who said, a good immigration policy can be summed up in one simple sentence: those who should get in, those who shouldn't get in, don't get in, and those who are here who shouldn't be here are required to leave. And, obviously in real life, it's a little more complicated than that, but I think that sums up a common sense immigration policy pretty well. And Barbara Jordan led a bipartisan commission on immigration reform in the 1990s that sought to recommend a policy that would fulfill those goals. And I don't think that our current immigration policy does actually live up to those objectives. But things are. The border crisis itself is just about over. And we still have some pressing problems within our country with respect to immigration enforcement. But I would like to see immigration reforms that modernize our immigration policy to better align it with the needs of our modern society and with Americans. And I think also lawmakers need to be careful to do no harm with immigration policy, to not have policies that disadvantage Americans or cause them to be disadvantaged whether in the job market or in other ways. So I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Madeline?
Good evening. I just want to preface everything by saying that any views that I express are completely my own. They are not those of the University of North Florida or the state university system. They are also not those of the American Enterprise Institute, the National Foundation for American Policy, or anyone else who has sponsored my research on the economics of immigration over the years. So I'm a labor economist. About 2 months ago, I gave a presentation at Cornell University, about 15 minutes of me talking what I thought about the economics of immigration. And then the person who was after me was a sociologist, and she said, she just views immigrants as labor units. I thought, well, okay, when you have a hammer, maybe everything is a nail. So that is very much my perspective, is to think about how immigrants contribute to our labor market. And so while, it was very interesting to hear Jessica's perspective, I think that we certainly have a need still for immigrants as workers in the United States, as well as people who are born in the United States as workers in the United States. We also need people who are going to contribute fiscally as we face a ever-looming debt and deficit to hopefully help pay that off in the future. I liked having low inflation, and so I like having people who produce goods and services here in the United States. So, here I am with my hammer, I guess, but that is certainly the lens from which I approach immigration, is that immigrants contribute a lot to our economy, and I hope that's something that after an hour you will be convinced of if you aren't already.
Well, thank you all for those introductory remarks. I would like to, given that we have 3 panelists with very, very different background, all of whom are active in the immigration policy space and all of whom have dedicated their careers to this area, but kind of come at this question of immigration policy from very, very different perspectives, whether it's an economic perspective, a criminology and criminal justice perspective, or the perspective of someone working in immigration policy research and advocacy. And so I'd like to ask each of our panelists just to say a little bit about what exactly are some of the major kind of challenges, some of the major questions of debate within their specific spheres, and what kind of the research on immigration and economics, immigration and and criminal justice, and the work that Jessica has done on things like human trafficking and kind of combating gang violence through immigration policy, just a little bit of what their careers and what their backgrounds kind of bring to this conversation and some of the major kind of questions and debates within their own particular areas of expertise. You can go in any order you like.
Want me to take it? We can just take turns. Thanks. Okay, that's a big question. I would say the biggest challenge in immigration policy today, in my opinion, is the legacy of the Biden administration's policies at the border and in the interior of the country that led to the arrival of more than 8 million new arrivals, new migrants from all over the world, most of whom were allowed to enter completely outside of legal channels or programs that were authorized by Congress. And Congress, under our Constitution, has plenary power over immigration. Congress writes the immigration laws and is supposed to decide who gets in. And that's a lot of people. It's the largest influx of people from abroad really in our history. And now, according to Census Department data, we have the highest percentage of our population that is foreign born than ever before in our history. This is uncharted territory for us as a nation. I believe we are a resilient nation and we will be able to manage, but it is something new, and it has brought these, the open border policies have created huge challenges in the places in the country that have had to absorb all of these new arrivals and where they have spent literally tens of billions of dollars in providing services to them. It's a challenge also because so many of these folks were admitted, or I should say, to use the technical term of immigration law, allowed to enter without any real path to legal status. They're here in limbo. And that's creates challenges because this was a unilateral act by the president to do this, and he kind of really just left it up to the states to cope with this influx of people, many of whom really needed a lot of services and needed shelter, a way to support themselves, and arrived with kids because anyone who arrived with a child was allowed to come in and bring that child with them. So the schools are facing huge challenges now to provide an education to kids without an increase in revenue to do that. So this is a big problem. The Trump administration has said that it wants to address this problem through enforcing immigration laws. I think that's necessary for a large share of the population. I also think that probably, as we go forward, now that things have changed, illegal entries at the border have gone down from a high of 11,000 a day to now less than 300 a day. So the influx itself has stopped, but we still have a lot of people here that where they're, aren't going to be on a path to any form of status that are going to have to be addressed. So.
I am not a lawyer, but my understanding is that Congress delegated to the executive branch the ability to parole people into the United States. And so there is this very interesting question for lawyers to decide about whether people who were allowed to enter into the United States, they were paroled in many cases, and allowed to then pursue asylum claims, or they were released with a notice to appear and are pursuing asylum claims, or they've been given what's called temporary protected status, and they are all allowed to apply for a work permit, whether they are legally present in the United States. I'm not sure. Again, I'm not a lawyer. What is very true, as Jessica said, is that there was an enormous increase in this group during the Biden administration. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the result of Biden administration policies. Part of it is that during the first Trump administration, there was a program that you may have heard of called Remain in Mexico, where people were basically not allowed to pursue asylum claims in the United States. They were basically massed along the US-Mexico border, and then they could come into the country potentially for hearings. So there was a large group that kind of wanted to pursue asylum claims because conditions in their home country were very bad. COVID hit, borders closed. The Trump administration invoked what's called Title 42, which basically allowed the Border Patrol to, if they apprehended somebody who was trying to cross the border illegally, to just push them back into Mexico without consequence, without being detained, so they could try again and again and again if they had the resources and the energy to do so, until they either gave up or succeeded, because the only way to apply for asylum was to get into the United States in order to be able to then pursue that claim, because we didn't allow people to do it at the border. So there was this kind of pent-up demand to enter the United States. And I think of it as picture a powder keg, right? And then we're into the Biden administration. COVID kind of eases up. And think about what the Florida economy was like in 2021. Enormous demand for labor, particularly jobs that didn't require a lot of formal qualifications. So there's this powder keg kind of people who want to enter the United States, perhaps to seek asylum, perhaps just because things in their home country were really bad, climate change, violence from gangs, and so on. And they want to come in. Then the match gets lit, and the matches are incredibly strong demand for workers in 2021, in 2022, and 2023 coming out of COVID. And so we had this group called the Surge coming into the United States that absolutely overwhelmed the border, right? And I think that the Biden administration, we could certainly disagree, and I think all of us do, perhaps in different ways, about how the Biden administration handled it. But I think that there's a lot of difficult choices to be made about, do you allow people to pursue asylum claims while they're here in the United States? Do you allow them to work legally while they're pursuing those claims? Do you give temporary protected status to people when things at home are truly horrible and allow them to remain in the United States and work legally? Some of these are ethical questions. Again, I'm an economist, so I can tell you having those workers has been really, really great for the economy overall, although perhaps not for some competing American workers, particularly earlier immigrants. But nonetheless, I think that there's been a whole lot going on that's very complicated indeed, and it certainly influenced the election.
Yeah, I think this is also a great example with immigration of the perception versus the reality. Not only was there incredible demand for people to get out of the border, there was a worldwide sentiment that Joe Biden was going to let you come over the border. Whereas in 2016 to 2017, we saw numbers decrease simply on the perception that Trump was going to lock you up or do something worse. And so one thing that this illustrates to me is the differences between sometimes perception and reality, because my understanding is when you look at the annual numbers, I think Obama deported more people than Trump did in his first term, and I think that Biden deported more people than Trump did. So technically, you had a greater likelihood of getting deported under these supposedly extremely liberal, wishy-washy immigration policies, because the immigrants that come, they are, and the immigration system is separate from the criminal justice system, right? They are two separate systems. So the people that I would deal with in the criminal justice system are not often rational, but immigrants are often very rational. So if they perceive that the cost of doing something is going to exceed the benefits, then they make a different choice. And so I think there's a little bit of that going on of Trump being seen as sending the message don't come, and people, potential immigrants saying, we believe you.
That drop in numbers people being what's called encountered, apprehended because they crossed the border illegally, that drop started as early as January of 2024. Definitely by summer of 2024, we were at low numbers and continued through the end of the Biden administration. So it's not that Trump suddenly, either won or went into office and the numbers fell as a result of that, as a result of kind of the Biden administration finally, honestly, cracking down on asylum in a way that a lot of people who are concerned about human rights are very worried about, and then spending a bunch of, honestly, our taxpayer dollars down in Central and South America to try to persuade people to not come and to get the militaries of those countries to make it harder for people to come into the United States. But I think it is hard to defend unauthorized immigration, and I'm not sure that I would, but I do think it's important to recognize that almost everyone who is an unauthorized, undocumented, illegal, pick your word, irregular immigrant would prefer to be here legally. But we have made it incredibly, incredibly hard to do that. My family, where that accent came from, my family came over in the 1800s. All you had to do was be able basically to pass the health check at Ellis Island or Corpus Christi or Galveston or wherever you entered. It wasn't particularly hard. Nowadays, it is incredibly hard to get a temporary worker visa, particularly if you are low skilled. It is incredibly hard to get a green card, legal permanent residence, unless you are the immediate relative of a U.S. citizen. We have made it so hard, in my opinion, unfortunately for the economy, to immigrate or to stay here legally in the United States, that we end up as a consequence with a very large unauthorized population that people are very unhappy about.
May I just say, and I think it does relate to this whole theme of what is the biggest challenge of immigration policy, probably none of us has really said, and that is the question, and this is the fundamental question of immigration policy, is how many people are going to be allowed to immigrate to the United States, given that I think we probably all agree that there is an insatiable demand around the world for people who would love to move to the United States. The Gallup poll, it's like over 1 billion people, I think, living in other countries who would, if given the opportunity, move here. So if you accept the assumption that we cannot accept everyone who would want to move here, and we probably should not accept just anybody who wants to move here, we have to have limits. And Congress decides what those limits are going to be, with the one exception, and that is refugee policy. Congress gave the president the ability to offer what's called parole, which was mentioned before, in very limited circumstances and not on a categorical basis, which is what the Biden administration was doing when it paroled more than, several million people. I think it's about 5 million people. But this is the fundamental question. How many, and once you decide how many it will be, who? And Congress has, I would disagree that it's actually hard to get a green card or a temporary visa. It's not hard at all if you actually qualify under the categories that Congress has created. And we have the most generous immigration policy in the world. We take in, sometimes I ask this question of audiences, how many people do you think we take in as legal immigrants every year? And people kind of go, a couple 100,000 or something. It's actually about 1 million every year. And the number of temporary workers is about 750,000 new temporary workers every year. in not only skilled categories or so-called skilled categories, but categories that are supposed to be for people with a college degree, but also many people coming in who for seasonal labor or agricultural work, hundreds of thousands every year, new people. So I think we have a very generous legal immigration system. The problem is that, Congress has decided, and I think wisely, that we should have limits on it. And if you're going to have limits, as Barbara Jordan said, you have to enforce them or the law really has no meaning. But that's the fundamental question. How many and who?
The thing is, we're a really big country. So 1 million new green cards every year sounds really big. Perhaps out of 330 million people here, not so big. Maybe plus half of that million, so 500,000 were already here, typically on some type of temporary visa, and then they're able to adjust status to what's called a permanent resident visa or a green card. The 750,000 roughly new temporary workers coming in every year, well, some of those are people who have to rotate every year, like the 350,000 H-2A farm workers. Now, personally, I prefer they probably be legal on these temporary worker visas and rotating through than unauthorized immigrants. But back to the million out of the 330 million or whatever, it sounds like a large number. 15% of our population is foreign born. Australia, 30% maybe. Canada, way higher than us. New Zealand, way higher than us. A lot of Western Europe, higher than us as well. We used to be able to say we're a nation of immigrants and it distinguished us from the rest of the world. Now we actually have a lower share foreign born than a lot of other countries that are of similar kind of socioeconomic status, if you will. So I don't think it's a distinguishing feature. And if anything, we're kind of behind the curve. And it very much worries me as an economist. And I think we'll come back to that later.
Well, thank you. Well, you had actually anticipated what my next question was going to be, which is about the Biden administration and immigration. So let's move on to talk a little bit about the role that immigration played in our recent presidential election campaign. And as I said at the beginning of tonight's event, public opinion polls taken during the 2024 campaign indicated that immigration was, in fact, a major issue on the minds of American voters in this election. And of those who ranked immigration as one of their most important concerns, those voters overwhelmingly supported the Republican nominee, former President Trump, over the Democrat Vice President Kamala Harris. And President Trump made the issues of both immigration and economics and immigration and crime central kind of planks in his appeal on this particular issue. And so the question to the panel is, what is it that you think that Americans were looking for in terms of immigration policy, moving on from the Biden administration when they decided to re-elect Donald Trump as president?
Okay, yes, sorry. I kind of like to take, the 250-year view of this when it comes to the public's reaction to immigration, because somehow everybody has forgotten that the entire nation has been both built on immigrants and built on hating immigrants. If you look back to colonial days, the big problem was the Germans. In the early days of the Republic, it was the French, right? The Alien and Sedition Act, which Trump has said, that sounds like a great idea. He's bringing it back. That was initially used against French immigrants. My ancestors were Irish. There's a reason there's still a mascot called the Fighting Irish, and there's a common belief that all Irish people are drunk leprechauns, because that was a specific public perception that existed in the 1800s of Catholics, of Germans, of people who were of a religion that didn't fall under Protestantism. So people, like, oh, we just all of a sudden in 2015, we all of a sudden started, disliking the immigrants. Nothing could be more true. And concerns, even the specific concerns, strains on schools. If you go back to the 1800s, they had separate schools for white kids, Chinese kids, and Japanese kids in San Francisco, right? Which we think of the, a bastion of wilderness or whatever, homelessness now. But regardless, it is the same thing repeating over and over and over again. There's always concern about the newcomers coming. And when it comes to this issue of the labor market, as I said, I mean, if it wasn't for Chinese and Irish immigrants, there'd be no railroads. So we have long relied on the immigrant as a source of cheap labor. And I guess this is really kind of a question for Madeleine because she's the expert. So much of it to me seems as being just driven by the economics of it. Like they won't come if we don't have jobs for them is the kind of like what the economic resolution that I arrive at when I look at these things, because historically immigration has been driven, yes, by the idea that we need cheap labor, whether it's in, a factory in Lynn, Massachusetts, or an automobile factory outside of Detroit, or, the B&O Railroad. We've always turned to immigrants and immigration to fill those roles. And so I kind of just try to see it more in context, as this is a common cause of concern historically throughout the course of the Republic. If you read the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that they complained about with the Crown was immigration. So even the founding fathers had problems with immigration, vis-a-vis King George. So, I try to look at it. I'm not an economic expert of how many, people we can take at one time, but I do know that there's a bit of a moral panic that goes on with immigration. And it's not the first, and it certainly won't be the last.
Where to start on that, on the labor market effects? Okay. I said in my answer to the first question, I think it was, that one of the goals of our immigration policy should be to have a policy that does not disadvantage Americans. And the issue of employers wanting cheap labor is at the central heart of this issue. Madeleine's right. We are a huge country. 300, almost 40 million people. That means we don't really have a labor shortage here that we need immigrants to fill. And we know this, economists know this, because we have, first of all, wages in certain jobs, especially those that are filled by newcomers and legal immigrants and people without a high school degree, those wages have not gone up that much. The other issue is, yes, employers are hiring recent immigrants. In fact, something like a colleague of mine just came out with a report this week that found that 72% of the job growth in the last year has gone to foreign-born workers. But at the same time, so it's great. Immigrants have very high labor force participation rates, which is great. They're here to work. That is the main reason people come here, whether legally or illegally. The problem is we have the highest rates of people dropping out of the labor force that we've had in decades. We have 6 to 7 million people of working age who have stopped looking for jobs, who have been closed out of the labor market than we've had in a very long time. It's 20% of Americans of working age are not working. And it used to be in 1960, the year I was born, it was only 11%. So we have a real crisis in our country of people who are of working age who are not able to find job opportunities. And they don't show up in the unemployment rate because that's counted differently. There's this, the official unemployment rate is rather low, but the rates of people who've dropped out of the workforce are way too high. So I just personally, and most of these people are people who, for whatever reason, haven't had the chance to get a college degree. They're already on the margins of society. And I don't think concern for those people who are not able to have access to these job opportunities because employers want to hire new arrivals who, for whatever reason, are going to work for less, or who are able to replace their American workers through visa workers. Concern for those Americans is not the same as hatred of immigrants. You mentioned the railroad workers. There were Americans working on building the railroads across our country. They were replaced by workers from abroad. And so I just think, in any policy matter, there are winners and losers, and immigration policy is no different. And the losers historically during times of mass immigration have been those American workers who, for whatever reason, are not as well educated, not as easy to employ. But in my opinion, our government should be working on finding ways to prevent employers from hiring illegal immigrants in particular, instead of these American workers who need job opportunities. It's causing a social crisis in our country in many ways. A lot of social issues are linked to unemployment, whether it's broken families or drug addiction or violence and crime. And I think that while reducing immigration is not going to solve those problems by any means, allowing employers to have an unchecked stream of workers who are going to be chosen instead of those American workers. I think American employers should have to compete for American workers first before we turn to easy foreign labor that comes at a cheaper price. Because cheap labor is expensive in other ways.
Should we let them unionize to protect their wages, the Americans, and stop
Sure.
the corporations? But see, it's like kind of the difficult politically, right? The way people align, because conservatives are now championing anti-immigration policies on the basis of the American worker because they're downtrodden. But at the same time, they don't allow workers or the working class, they don't support policies that allow them to unionize, to get family leave. In fact, we as taxpayers are subsidizing many corporations, right?
Absolutely.
Which I find, like you, totally unacceptable.
Yes.
Just mathematically unacceptable. So why don't we do
bargain.
it's so much beyond immigration, just sort of the tangled web of these policies. It's not just immigration, it's economics and education, and why is there more people now that are being left behind?
Right.
More so.
Immigration's a choice. That's a policy
Correct.
choice we have.
Right. It's, yeah. And in some ways, I guess, when we talk about like education and things like that, it's kind of the easiest thing to wrap your head around, to just say how many people are coming in, as opposed to how do we systemically help, the lower classes. A lot more challenging.
Madeline, you're our economist. Can you
We've
settle this one?
had since the late 1970s, enormous change in the United States, and to many people, perhaps immigrants are the most visible part of that change. And it is absolutely true that until very recently, for workers who were at kind of the bottom end of the education distribution, particularly men, things were quite bleak. Their wages adjusted for inflation were falling. Their employment prospects didn't look great. And it is very easy to attribute that to immigration. But I think almost all economists would agree that immigration is one of three components, and the other two are much bigger in that decline. One is technological change, automation. The robots came for their jobs in the factories, at the switchboards, at the typewriters, and so on. And now they're coming for ours in terms of AI, which is making me nervous, but that's a separate story. So technological change. And then offshoring, globalization, right? We had changes in trade policy. We had the emergence of China as a manufacturing superpower, heavily probably subsidized by its government, such that perhaps there aren't fair trade, if you will, in terms of equal support from governments. And I think that the increasing amount of international trade and technological change account for far more of these troubling changes that we have seen in the labor market. And again, they're kind of now spreading to other parts of the labor market, which is going to make what's going to happen in the future very interesting. So to return to the original question, I think, there's a political scientist, I believe, named Alexander Kustov, who's at the University of North Carolina system, who does very interesting work looking at voting, which is not something that I study. And his view on X, where I'm a big follower of him, is that it's not that Americans are opposed to large numbers of immigrants or large immigrant inflows. It's when they feel unmanaged. And indeed, that is what we have largely felt over the past few years. And so I think that that's a large part of why we saw what happened in 2024.
So we've kind of touched on the question of border security and illegal immigration, and actually to kind of follow on directly from Madeline's final comment there, I think there is some fairly clear evidence that a majority of Americans are pretty supportive of immigration in general, but they also overwhelmingly believe that it should follow a regular and orderly process, and that the people who do come to the United States should do so legally. And I think that's one of the concerns that the Trump administration has moved immediately to try and address. We've seen moves in the area of border security, emergency powers, and additionally related to the question of birthright citizenship related to illegal immigration as well. And of course, the ultimate fate of these policies will depend on the outcome of the various legal challenges that are currently playing out before the federal courts. But getting back to the question then of how the government can effectively deliver on what it is that the American people are looking for from immigration policy. Back in 2000, the federal government spending on the border patrol on border security was about $1 billion, and then in 2024, border patrol spending was $5 billion, 5 times higher than it was in 2000. But to me, at least, it seems like we're still having many of the same conversations about securing the border that we were having 25 years ago. And so is there a better approach than what it is that we've seem to be doing and trying and failing at, which is spending more money on border security, hiring more border patrol agents? How can the federal government manage this question of illegal immigration in an effective way, rather than just making it an expensive problem that we seem to have been unable to solve for decades at this point?
Yes, so that is, of course, the key question. Again, I would point to the history of immigration reform. So you mentioned Ronald Reagan, who in '86 signed sweeping immigration reform, essentially gave amnesty to 8 million, about 3. Okay, so so I kind of see this as a bit like the goalposts have moved. Like Ronald Reagan, despite being a conservative hero, would be kicked out of the party for his liberal immigration views at this point in time. And, back in During the Obama administration, they had 58 votes in the Senate to do immigration reform. That was being worked on by people like Lindsey Graham and the late Senator John McCain. It was a bipartisan effort. I think that we've really seen that just fall by the wayside. I mean, when I think about 2 votes short of overcoming a filibuster on that. Can you imagine, does anything pass, right? Like with 58 or get close to that anymore? Everything is, 50 and the VP breaks it, right? Whether it's Harris or Vance. So, right. So exactly. The reconciliation, which is just a fancy word for kick the can. So I think that it is a situation of moving goalposts, perhaps on both political sides. But certainly historically speaking, the right has become, it's very different than the things that were championed under, say, George W. Bush or later back in history, Ronald Reagan. Neither one of those and their policy views on immigration would have much space in the political landscape today, I think. And that makes it challenging and probably why we sit here and scratch our heads and try to figure it out, because there has to be some sort of, reconciliation between the two. And I don't see that happening. I don't know. You're more in the policy space and the political space.
Yeah, well, you're right. I think when you said earlier that immigration is never really a partisan issue per se. I mean, I think there's just people who want to see more of it and think it's an unequivocal good, that there's, no downside to immigration. And there are people who want limits, want it controlled. Many people now want even legal immigration reduced, as I do. So it has become more partisan, but that is a fairly recent phenomenon. But just because something is bipartisan, it doesn't mean that it's going to pass, as we saw with the failed bill from the Senate last year. And the reason that bill failed was not because Donald Trump was against it. It was because most people in the Senate were not really for it either, that it was, negotiated kind of in a bubble without buy-in from people who were going to vote on it. And one of the reasons was, is that its approach to border security was to throw more money at it. And to your point, Nick, we keep spending more and more on border security, but that's not really what can fix the problem. And we've seen that just in the last 3 weeks, whereby, first we saw under the Biden administration did less with more money than ever before in our history, less border security with more money. What's important is not how many Border Patrol agents you have or how many fancy sensors you have. If you have policies that almost guarantee that anyone who makes it to the border and sets foot on U.S. soil is going to be released into the country and given a work permit, you're never going to be able to control the flow. It's going to get out of control as it did over the last 4 years. As you said, migrants are not stupid. They're very rational, as a matter of fact, and they are not going to turn their life savings and their safety over to a criminal smuggling organization to come here illegally. And, unless they think that they're going to be rewarded with the ability to stay here indefinitely. As I said, we went from 11,000 a day to less than 300 a day, not by throwing more money at the border, because that hasn't happened, but by a change in policies where now people are not, there's no more catch and release at the border. There's a real risk of enforcement. If you were to make it around our border control and make it into the country, you could potentially be subject to arrest and removal. That's not what people want, so they're not coming. It's not too hard to understand, I don't think.
Well, I think back to something Holly said, if we want less immigration, the way to get it is to have a big old recession. I don't want that. right? But think back to the Great Recession, and it's the word economists use, of 2007 to 2009, when, housing values in Florida fell by 40%. That was the point when unauthorized immigrant inflows from Mexico turned negative. More people left than were coming into the United States from Mexico because of the recession, right? Only in this very strong economy that we've had post-COVID, where there's huge unmet demand for workers because they're jobs Americans don't want. They can't afford the daycare. They're better getting more money on disability pay. I don't know. There's a lot going on there. That those flows began to turn positive again. But we're now in a situation where immigrants are coming from all over the world because they can get a job here. It's a very tough problem to solve because nobody wants that recession. And the police state we would have to probably have to make sure that people can't work if they don't have the right papers is something that I think, I would leave to Holly to talk about that kind of enforcement, what it might be like. But I think that a lot of civil libertarians might be very worried about it.
Yeah, I will say there's actually been very little empirical study of the actual policies, right? Like what actually works. But there was a study that was done in Arizona that suggested E-Verify was actually a more viable way to police immigration than wanting the criminal justice system to do it. Make it a labor market issue. As opposed to a criminal justice issue. And I think that, I can only say what the data have said, right? And the data have suggested that E-Verify does work. Now, as you mentioned, maybe there are some libertarians that will have a problem with that because what Arizona did was taking biometric data from people in addition to just the regular computer system of E-Verify. But it was shown to be successful in identifying undocumented workers.
I have like 7 published papers on E-Verify, so sorry. I could go on and on, but I will try to restrain myself. The issue with E-Verify is that Arizona, which was the first state to require everyone to basically, kind of show their papers to get a job. It kind of worked because not many other states had it yet, right? And so just a lot of unauthorized immigrants left Arizona in 2008. Think what was happening to the Arizona housing and economy at the time anyway. People left and went to other states in the area. If we did it nationally, it's a lot less clear what would happen. And it would be a lot less clear who would build the houses here, who would mow the lawns, who would take care of children, who would take care of the elderly as home health aides. I think it's the idea that there's a whole big pool of Americans who aren't working, of working age, non-disabled, who would love to take those jobs at prices that Americans can afford to pay. I don't think it's there. I think we need immigrants as part of our labor force.
Okay, I just have to say that this idea that there are jobs Americans won't do is not only not true, but kind of offensive, that Americans would, shun hard work. I just don't believe it. And the statistics disprove it. Let me tell you a story about what happened. First of all, it has been federal law that people have to establish that they're authorized to work since 1986. What E-Verify does is give employers a reliable way to verify that. And it is something like 99.6% accurate in doing that. But let me just tell you a story which I think illustrates really well this kind of race to the bottom that happens when we allow unchecked immigration. When I was living in Massachusetts in the Boston area, at a certain point, there were 3 Hyatt hotels there, and they had about 92 housekeeping staff. And these were all Americans and legal immigrants, mostly women, who'd had these jobs for years and years, raised their families on these jobs. At the time, they were making what was a good wage at 14 something an hour. They had paid vacation, they had health insurance, they could take sick days. Hyatt hotels decided that they wanted to change that. And so they hired a staffing company out of Georgia. They called in the 92 housekeepers and said, we want you to train these workers. They told them that they were going to be their vacation replacements, but it turned out they were actually their replacements. They said that they fired all the 92 housekeepers and said, you've got to reapply for your job through the staffing company. The staffing company at the time was paying these workers $7-something an hour, no vacation, no sick leave, no benefits of any kind. And most of the workers the staffing company brought in from Georgia were not authorized to work here. They were here illegally. So, it's a race to the bottom if we allow employers to get away with replacing American workers with workers who will work for less. And, we don't have to force the country into a recession to address illegal hiring. In fact, the decline in the illegal population that occurred at the time of the recession had started well before the recession. It started in 2007. At the time, Congress had given a lot of money for immigration enforcement to the agencies. This was right after an amnesty bill failed. And Congress said, we're not doing amnesty, we're going to invest in enforcement. And for 2 years, we actually had robust immigration enforcement, not only by the federal government, but also by a few states that took the lead, like Arizona and a few others, based on this idea that if employers can't get away with hiring illegal workers, the job magnet dries up. You don't have to go around door to door arresting illegal immigrants to reduce that population. They will go home on their own, and that is, in fact, what happened.
The housing bubble burst in 2006. That's why Mexican immigration stopped. But I think there are unquestionably companies that do dodgy things that we don't like. I'm not sure that immigration policy is the hammer for that particular nail necessarily. There's a study by an economist named Michael Clemens, who's at George Mason University, where he examined the H-2A temporary agricultural visa program, where employers, before they can bring in these foreign workers to do the jobs, to pick the crops for 10 months, working in very hard conditions, they have to advertise in state unemployment offices. So we got the data from North Carolina, where people basically, looked, how many people actually applied for the jobs that were advertised in the unemployment offices. It was like 10 Americans who applied for these jobs. How many showed up to work the first day? 3. How many made it for the first day? 1. I agree. It is somewhat offensive to think about there being immigrant jobs or jobs Americans won't do. All jobs should have dignity. It would be great if all jobs paid a lot and had wonderful benefits and so on. So I am definitely, uncomfortable, even as an economist, with some of this. But I think having a lot of people here makes us great. And I'm really grateful that a lot of people want to be here.
So in just a moment, we'll begin our Q&A. So if there are any audience members who would like to ask a question of our panel, please do go ahead and come up to the microphones at the front. I do want to quickly finish, though, with the question that I always ask at the end of our Diverse Perspectives events, and that is to ask our panelists, for the students in the room who may be interested in working in the immigration policy sphere or getting involved in immigration advocacy, what would your advice be to them, and what should be their takeaways from this discussion as to how they can make a difference when it comes to immigration policy and the issues that they care about?
The immigration issue is one of those issues that affects almost every aspect of our American society. And there are many angles to it, whether it's economic, public safety, demographics, fiscal policy. So it's a great field to get into And it's become a much bigger issue. Like I said, when I started on it, we'd be thrilled if there'd be a couple newspaper articles every couple of weeks. And now it's like this fire hose of attention to the issue, which I think is great because it is important. But again, just always remember, like, I don't think any public policy issues are cut and dried. I think that, like I said, there are winners and losers, and the issue often for policymakers is how to maximize benefits and minimize the harm to Americans. And I don't think there's been enough of that kind of thinking with our immigration policy, at least in the last 30 some years that I've been working on it.
I have a colleague who's a professor at Clemson, and his wife is from Ukraine, and her parents were stuck outside Kyiv when the bombing started last year, 2 years ago. God, it's been so long. And I'll say to you what he said to me: the immigration system is a mess. And that was even for a group of people who were allowed to come. So those of you that are interested in immigration, there's a lot of reforms that have to happen. So I would encourage you to inform yourself. Okay, don't just trust what we said. Go and look at the data. Go and look at the actual reports. The data can be found when you look for it. It can be difficult. I understand it's much easier to learn everything off of TikTok in 20-second snippets. But unfortunately, that's not really the way serious decisions are made. And so I would very much encourage you to do your own investigation. Those of you interested in the law, immigration specialization is in great need. We're short of those to serve as judges in the immigration system, advocates for immigrant families when they do come here, even those that are here legally under TPS protection. There's a lot of need in the system. And so if you are looking for something, you find this motivating, I think it is an area where you'll feel like your life and your career is not wasted doing it, that you're actually doing something important. But again, always look for the data. It's there. Yeah.
Well, let's not make up data. There are definitely winners and losers, but one thing is immigration overall makes the pie bigger, right? So how the sizes of the pie get divided up is a different story, and it's not clear, again, but going back to my metaphor, that immigration policy is the right hammer for that particular nail. But there will be huge need for immigration lawyers. They are certainly battling it out in the courts like mad on both sides. So that seems like it's going to continue to be a booming industry for a very long time. Volunteer for a campaign that you care about. I think that that's a great way to get involved.
Okay, do we have any questions from our audience members for tonight's panel? Go ahead, sir.
There's been a lot of talk about the Lincoln-Riley Act. Mr. Governor DeSantis now decided to start all the highway patrol people are going to start enforcing federal laws. What do you see happening with the unfunded mandate of the Lincoln-Riley Act and the fact that now some of these red states going to provide law enforcement that's unfunded by the government? How is that going to impact our tax base?
Okay, well, I will go, and yes, that's an excellent point. And it really kind of gets to the issue of local cooperation with federal immigration officials overall. Some cities do not participate or do not engage with the federal government out of principle, right? They're a sanctuary city. But what's often not mentioned is the incredible cost for local law enforcement agencies to shoulder the burden that is specifically given to the federal government through the Constitution and through court decisions. I mean, if you remember, Trump initially, he banned 7 countries. This was a case that went up to the Supreme Court, and they said that, the president can do, he has more leeway with immigration than he does with a lot of things, right? So this gives people the ability to do this, but again, without the resources, it's going to come down to Congress to cough up the money. If Florida wants to engage the highway patrol, then Tallahassee is going to have to come up with the money. Given the climate, I don't think that that's necessarily unlikely. I think that they might underestimate, given in a state like Florida, which is a high immigrant concentration state, a high immigrant arrival state, right? Most immigrants live in 4 states. Florida is one of them. So I think that without additional monies from either Tallahassee or DC, that's going to be virtually impossible to do full force while maintaining the initial goals of the Florida Highway Patrol and their initial their as described duties.
Well, what the Florida Highway Patrol and any other, and there are other local law enforcement agencies in Florida that do enforce federal immigration laws under a special program called 287G, and one of the most prominent is Collier County that does it. And I've actually spent a fair amount of time with the sheriff's office there and in other sheriffs and other law enforcement agencies all over the country. And the purpose of their engagement is to assist the federal government in removing that very small fraction of the illegal population who have committed and been arrested for state and local crimes. And there is a criminal infrastructure that supports illegal immigration that, you know, so there is a public safety benefit to doing this, but with respect to the, you know, because we have enough American criminals, right? We don't, you know, there's no benefit to our society for allowing people who are causing problems in our communities, and particularly immigrant communities, to remain here in defiance of law. If they're criminals, and that's what the focus of that is. But with respect to the cost of it, it turns out that these programs actually save taxpayer money because these individuals are removed from the country rather than being allowed to stay here with the high recidivism rate and continue preying on people in the communities and continue sapping the resources of our criminal justice system. So it's really more of an investment, particularly in Collier County. I know that they found that through their 287G program, partnering with the feds, that they actually saved a lot of county taxpayer dollars by doing so because of the high cost, not only to taxpayers, but also to the victims of allowing people who are committing crimes on a repetitive basis to, you know, to allow them to stay in the county rather than removing them to their home country.
David, I apologize. I'm going to use that question as a launching point to talk about something slightly different, but that relates to a bunch of points Jessica just made. And I want to make sure that no one leaves here tonight with the misapprehension that immigrants are more likely to commit crimes than U.S. natives. Virtually every study shows that immigrants are less likely than similar U.S. natives to commit crimes, in large part because they realize they're likely to be deported if caught for it ultimately. And they don't want to do that because they've spent a lot of time, money, and energy to get here, and being here helps them and it helps their families. So they're less likely to commit crimes. Now, do horrible things happen like Laken Riley? Absolutely. And that is not good. But please don't leave here thinking that immigrants commit more crimes or are more likely to commit a crime than a U.S. native. It's just not true.
Go ahead.
I don't know if this works. Okay, cool. One of the panelists mentioned a question that I feel like was never answered in regard to unions. It's been mentioned that immigrants are being hired because they're cheap labor due to the fact that they are paid a lot of times under the table. Our economy is reliant on the fact that they're easily exploitable. A lot of times they work very grueling jobs. As an example, I was a lifeguard and I had to quit my job because of the conditions. So a lot of them are like construction workers and gardeners. Frankly, a lot of Americans, I feel, wouldn't want to do these jobs. And I'm not saying it to generalize, but because I know that I couldn't do those jobs. But for the wages that these immigrants are currently being paid, far below livable, I feel like it's not even imaginable that they would want to work these jobs. So my question is, wouldn't the biggest way to incentivize young United States citizens in need of jobs to do these jobs to be to create strong unions and higher pay, which is something that Republicans have historically been against? An answer in a yes or no, please.
Economists can't give yes or no. It has to be, it depends. I'm sorry.
Is the question, should we promote unionization? Yes, why not? And, you know, if there were one thing that we should take out of the equation, I believe, is the staffing companies, who are often the ones that are exploiting the workers, and, you know, enticing them to come here. And, you know, I find that to be an unhelpful role in these guest worker programs and generally throughout the labor market.
Yeah, I think history shows that a company, a corporation, whatever, will get away as much as you let them when it comes to their workers. And just look at the history of the Industrial Revolution. If you don't believe me, you know, children used to work in factories because they had small fingers. So the people who are aiming to maximize their profits, in many cases, will do almost anything to do that. So yes, is the answer to unionize them? Probably. And I mean, you could probably address this with the meatpacking industry, the agricultural industry, and hospitality. And that would be three of the major areas where I would think immigrants are being exploited the most. But I will kick that over to our resident economist.
Agriculture. I think the issue is sort of how much do we want things to happen here in the United States, and how much are we willing to pay for them? Are we willing to live with fewer goods, particularly locally made goods and services, and have them cost more? These are choices, and the choice America has made is to have a very abundant society where we own a lot of stuff, we have big houses, we get a lot of services, and so on. And if we didn't, if labor cost a lot more jobs would move overseas, certainly, and it's not clear that we would necessarily have a higher standard of living. I think, as Jessica said, there are winners and losers from all of that. But, you know, I am a member of our union, so there we go.
Go ahead.
So I heard that the Center for Immigration Studies has been deemed as a hate group by Southern Poverty Law. And when I looked into it a little bit, I read that CIS has platformed white nationalists, racists, and Holocaust deniers, spread blatant lies, tried to portray immigrants as terrorists, went as far to call literal children terror babies, called immigrants third world gold diggers, and said that Black people were uncivilized. And I feel like the name CIS and the platform that it's given at this university makes it appear to be a legitimate organization, but it, like, looking into it at all, it's not. It's an anti-immigrant think tank that peddles false information and white nationalism. So my question is, how do you justify being in a hate group, Jessica Vaughn? And do you think that it's acceptable for members of hate groups to speak on our campus?
You have incorrect information. What you're repeating is a lie and a smear that came from people who admitted in court when we sued them that they did this because they disagreed with our positions and wanted to deplatform and ruin us as people. So it's wrong. You have wrong information.
Southern Poverty Law is a reputable organization, and they have a page about CIS with plenty of information about all of the things that have come out from CIS.
So I think you need to do a little more research into the Southern Poverty Law Center as well, which is a once respected organization, but which whose reputation, in particular, partly because of this reason that they decided to smear people instead of engage in debate, that they have, been thoroughly discredited. So I think you need to do a little more research and not maybe judge people based on one source. Like, I think one of the things you probably learn here in college is that, you can't rely on one source. Maybe you should look at original sources, look at our work. I'm not sure, those terms that you mentioned, are not on our website.
There are many direct quotes from things that CIS has put out.
Have you read them?
Yes, I have. And there are also blatant Holocaust deniers.
That's absolutely
platformed.
false and insulting and wrong. And, it's not true.
Listen to CIS. We don't want white nationalism.
Okay, my question's not related to that, but I gotta rethink what I was gonna say now. So there's a book called Maximum Canada. It is written by Doug Saunders. It's the idea that there's a limited number of people in this world, and that the number of people is going to go down eventually. So how should we plan immigration-wise for a world where we might not be able to get immigrants, economically wise, where we might have to compete with countries like China and India with populations of 1.4 billion, and how can we prepare ourselves for a world where we can't get people as a resource? Should we push into automation, or should we push into AI maybe to replace possible human jobs that we can't fulfill?
I am so glad you asked that, because I was hoping that we would make our way back to this topic, and I never got there. The Congressional Budget Office put out estimates in January that by 2033, 8 years from now, absent additional immigration, the U.S. population will shrink. And I think that your colleague's report that you mentioned that came out this week, it reaches kind of a similar conclusion because the data are the data. So we won't grow very soon absent immigrants. And a lot of countries are already where we will be, and they are shrinking absent immigrants. They're aging. They're not having births replace deaths. This is a terrifying thing, particularly if you own stocks or a home, right? And if you're aging, as to who is going to help take care of you, who's going to help take care of your neighbors. And I don't know if the robots will be able to do it. I don't think that AI itself certainly can. So I'm very, very worried. And I think we need to step up our game and attract people and make it possible for them to come here legally and stay here legally.
Well, I think there is a role for technology to play in this. We need to be, our goal should be to have our economy be more productive. And I think that there's an appropriate role for technology to do that. I mean, look how we adapted during the pandemic, using technology, for example, for ordering in restaurants, for, food deliveries and whatnot. I think our goal as a country should be to have a high wage economy, not to depend on low wage labor. If you look, let's take for the dairy industry, for example. The dairy industry in this country is often lobbying for more visas for people, foreign workers, to come in to work on dairy farms. And yet in Europe, they don't depend on labor. They have invested in the technology so that cows can be milked by machines. And the jobs that are left are more challenging, require more skills, and pay more. And so they've been able to maintain an industry without relying on cheap labor to do it. And I think we need to look at doing that more in agriculture and hospitality and many other sectors of our economy, that's how we're going to progress and become more productive, not by thinking that we can solve our fertility problem or any other problem just by bringing in more people. Good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say simply, once they can maximize a profit using the computer or the AI, that's when it'll happen. It's just simply put. I don't know what areas that will be. I mean, the farm workers have been fighting since the cotton gin, so I don't know eventually if it will come to the point where everything can be done in an automated sense. If my Siri is any indication, it's not going to be anytime soon. So fear not.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, we'll go here and then back. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, just trying to gather my thoughts real quick. I kind of wrote everything down. First of all, I want to give a little bit of context for who I am. My father was born in the UK. He came over here legally, and it upsets me to hear about those coming over illegally, because I watched my father as I grew up work to come here legally, and I'm super grateful to be an American citizen myself. I thank my Lord and Savior every day for the opportunities that this country gives me. And I just wanted to present my main idea when thinking about this, kind of stimulate maybe some thoughts that you might have about that. And that is that I deem illegal immigrants, all of them, to be criminals, because in order to get here, they had to break our immigration laws. So how would you justify that under the law? Does that make sense? Or if you want me to elaborate more.
Yes, well, I would say there's some people who do, as the people you're suggesting, who are running over the border, right? I mean, just boom. But there's a lot of the people who have come over the last 4 years who are presenting themselves as asylum cases, and that can only be done in person. Otherwise, you would be in your home country and you would apply for refugee status, which is something different legally. So it is, yes, these are people who have broken the law in the sense, but to paint everybody who is here illegally, or undocumented as having done something nefarious is a little incorrect. And in fact, most of the people the number one reason people are here illegally is because they've overstayed their visas. So that's another area of the law that a lot of people don't really know about, and it's an area that has potential enforcement implications.
Yeah, I mean, tolerating illegal immigration is a slap in the face to people who've come to this country through our legal immigration system. There's no question about it. I was going to address something you said. It is a crime to cross illegally. I believe that most enforcement should be directed at, like I said, that fraction of the population that's here illegally and has committed state and local crimes, been arrested for it. They can be turned over to immigration enforcement. But as for the asylum seekers, what we know from the data that's been collected by the Justice Department is of the people who've come and said they fear return, only about 10% of them end up actually being able to qualify for asylum and are awarded asylum by an immigration judge. Of those who are allowed in to file an asylum claim, only half of them actually file an application for asylum claim. Of those who do, only half of them will show up for their proceedings in court. Of those who do, only about 10% are found to be qualified for asylum. Most have come here because they know that they will be allowed in and will be given a work permit under, at least that was true under the Biden administration policies, and they're taking advantage of the opportunity. So it doesn't make, I believe it doesn't make any sense to allow people to come in and file an asylum application when we know that 90% of them aren't going to qualify. And that's why the policy of Remain in Mexico was started, was to say, okay, sure, you can apply for asylum, but you can wait in Mexico and apply from there. So this idea that what happened in the last 4 years was some kind of humanitarian immigration program is absolutely misleading. In fact, most of these people weren't even coming from their home countries. People like, especially the Venezuelans, Cubans, and Haitians, were already resettled in other countries, whether it's Spain, Peru, Chile, Brazil, They came because they had the opportunity to say that they needed to apply for asylum when what they intended was pretty much just to stay here and game our system. So, that's what is going to make it so difficult going forward, is to figure out what to do with all these people who really don't have a path and are not truly eligible for asylum because they were firmly resettled.
Yeah, absolutely. I have an article forthcoming in the Southern Economic Journal about that we're in this pickle because of this very large population that has these liminal temporary statuses that are expiring or being revoked by the new Trump administration. And they don't have a path to legal permanent residence, U.S. citizenship, or anything like that. But I'm not sure that I would force them to wait in Mexico under very difficult circumstances. And I think it's also, there's a lot, it's so complicated because there's countries that have refused to take deportations. So we can't just ship people back to Cuba, except to Guantanamo. For many years, we couldn't send people back to Venezuela. We couldn't send them to Nicaragua. We couldn't send them to Haiti and so on. And so we do have these populations that if they made it across the border, we couldn't send them back. And so it's a hard problem to solve.
Thank you for your time.
Sure.
Good evening, and thank you for your dialogue this evening. So I want to ask, relevant to what they're talking about, moving the goalpost, or even how we've seen parties flip-flop when it comes to their view on immigration, that part of that I would argue could be intentional, sort of polarization, trying to either pander or create a voting base. And even as we've seen tonight, when it comes to those on the anti-immigration, they may be called neoliberal or un-American, on the other side called white nationalists or something of the sort. But even now, so we've seen Trump run heavily on being anti-immigration. Now that he's been in office, the deportation numbers seem like they're not going to reach what he said. We've even kind of seen the conversation shift away from that over to foreign policy. So I would ask if even like a parallelism could be when it comes to foreign policy. A lot of times we see politicians run as we're anti-war or we're the anti-war ticket, but then they continue to either be proactive in war or fund war. So I suppose just to culminate, it would be kind of serving the institutions or what they would call the national interest versus actually serving the people's interest or who those they say they're trying to support.
Well, I mean, that's a hard question because you're asking us to get into the minds of politicians and, how sincere are they in what they believe, and what they believe is an empirically demonstrable problem, relative to, just as you say, trying to curry favor with a particular voting bloc. And that could go for either side, right? On both sides of the extreme. So I mean, it's for me, it's almost impossible to say. I will say this: is immigration and our foreign policy closely related? Yes, it is. And so I think that it's not to pivot towards a foreign policy approach as sort of one of the elements of the, to remedy this issue, I think is probably smarter than simply going at it from an immigration enforcement from Homeland Security. I think bringing in the State Department for career foreign service officers to do what they do to try to deal with these countries of origin. It's this, there's certain hot spots, right? And there's something about those places structurally that are going to continue to motivate people to leave. So until those things change, it's always going to seem better to walk from Venezuela to Texas than it is to stay under the Maduro regime or what have you. So I think foreign policy, yes, that people might say, oh, we're to pivot because, he's not deporting as much as he wanted. I think that that's probably a wise move, to kicking it over to the State Department to try to figure out how to deal with these countries of origin.
Yeah, I haven't seen any indication that the Trump administration is really pivoting. I think they approached this from the beginning as needing attention at the border, direct enforcement action, and changes in policy. Also with diplomatic efforts, particularly with Colombia, we've seen El Salvador, Mexico, and Venezuela in terms of getting them to work with us on this problem. And, you know, especially with Mexico, it's been remarkable. And I think that this approach is going to be borne out because there is a criminal infrastructure that supports and facilitates illegal migration, and the people making the most money off of it are not necessarily the employers, as we've been talking about, but the cartels, making, you know, something like $13 billion a year on smuggling migrants and trafficking migrants. And to the extent that we can disrupt that through changes in policy and through enforcement, that is going to help Mexico also in terms of their civil society, because the cartels will be less powerful, less able to get their way with Mexican lawmakers, and that's going to be a good thing for everybody.
Thank you.
So we're running a little low on time. I want to make sure our remaining questioners have their say. So I will ask our panel to be as brief as possible in their responses. Go ahead, sir.
Good evening. I'm Pat Hines, a professor of naval studies. I want to thank Dean Seabrook and the university for hosting these. I've made it to a few of them. They're very enriching, and I thank you all for your insights tonight. They're definitely helpful for me. My studies focus primarily on human vulnerabilities and migration issues. So one of the things that I'm very interested in, and I think you've talked about it a little bit, but maybe not directly, is since we know that immigration is going to continue to be a thing and human migration is going to continue to happen indefinitely, how do you see the integration or assimilation aspect that ends this, that's going to terminate with that in somebody's life, right? So how do you see that? I really appreciate it.
Well, that's a great question, actually. And I'm very hopeful about, I think that the United States of America has the best record for welcoming and assimilating new immigrants and making them into Americans generally. But I do think that we face challenges in that recently and going forward, because of, first of all, the large number of people who've arrived, and the fact that some of our institutions in our country are less interested in that as a goal than was the case, 100 years ago or so. And I'm thinking about schools and churches and local governments, which once thought it was very important to support immigrants by helping them learn English and helping them become citizens and become Americans. And I don't think that is as strong as it once was. And I do think that the numbers are important as well, that, our country really needs to think about looking at a reduction in legal immigration to give us and our communities time to absorb the immigrants that have arrived here, and that's going to be very important. We've had constantly increasing immigration since the 1960s, whereas before in our history, we saw peaks and valleys, ups and downs, times where we did not have as much immigration. And those were times when more marginalized groups in our society, and I'm thinking particularly Blacks in America in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, were able to progress economically because they did not face a lot of competition from newly arriving immigrants. And, this kind of comment is not meant to be divisive at all. It's just, it's a fact that when employers have to compete for workers, they're going to cast down their bucket where they are to hire American workers. And we need to encourage that by limiting immigration.
Okay, our final question of the evening. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Mindy McClarty. I'm a reporter for Spinnaker Media, a student-run news source on campus. And I had a question about birthright citizenship. So I was talking to a different poli-sci professor on campus about the possible end of birthright citizenship, and he basically believes it's not really at risk because the rules of birthright citizenship are verbatim in the Constitution. And I was just wondering what your opinions are on that, and if you think it is at risk, what are the possible implications of an end of birthright citizenship for Americans and immigrants?
Yeah, I mean, if we all remember back to elementary school civics, it takes a lot to change the Constitution. So unfortunately, once something appears in there, it becomes all but impossible. Will the attempt be made? Yes, of course. Will it go to the federal courts? Will it ping pong away all the way up to the Supreme Court? Absolutely. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I'll pretend to be one and say I don't think that ending birthright citizenship is legal. Of a layman's pass. I don't think that that's going to stand up, but I do think it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court.
The evidence from European countries that don't have birthright citizenship but have somewhat liberalized their policies on giving citizenship to people who have been there since children is I think quite unambiguous that people assimilate better. So they learn the language faster, get more education, earn more, work in higher status, if you will, occupations and so on, if they have a clear path to citizenship. Even if they don't become citizens, just having the path. And so the possibility of not having birthright citizenship, I think record from other countries suggests you end up with a permanent kind of underclass that might be quite troubling.
I'm really glad that we're finally, I'm hopeful that we're going to actually get clarity on this question because it's not quite as clear cut as some opponents of changing it, I think, have presented it because the debate is over some words in the 14th Amendment, this phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and what that actually means. It's really only been decided that the children of lawfully admitted permanent residents who are not citizens, that their kids are citizens. What we don't know and what the Trump administration is trying to get clarity on is what about the children of people here illegally? What about the children of people here on a work visa? What about the children of birth tourists? And if they are, once the courts decide if it really does apply to them, then lawmakers can figure out whether we want to change it. And I think that it's really useful to have this discussion. It's been kind of a barstool discussion for decades now, and I'm glad that we're finally, somebody has decided to take it to the courts so that we'll know.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank everyone for coming tonight and also invite you to please enjoy the refreshments outside our venue tonight that have been generously provided by our colleagues at the Coggin College of Business who are co-sponsoring this event. And I would also like to extend a big thank you to Holly Miller, Jessica Vaughn, and Madeline Zavodny for joining us this evening and sharing their insights and expertise. Thank you all.